The lights went out first, and then the heat stopped working. Captain Lisa Carter stood on the bridge of the colony ship Meridian and watched the numbers on her screen turn red one by one. The fusion reactors that had powered their journey for 3 months were dead, and nothing she tried could bring them back to life. Outside the thick metal walls of the ship, space was darker and colder than anything humans had ever known. The ship carried 12,000 people who had left Earth, behind forever to find a new home among the stars. Now they were all going to die in the cold, empty space between worlds. Lisa pressed the button that would speak to everyone on the ship. Her voice echoed through every room and hallway when she said the words that would change everything. The reactors were broken. The heat was gone. They had maybe 2 days before the cold would kill them all. She told them to stay calm, but her own hands were shaking as she spoke. When she finished talking, the ship became very quiet for a few seconds. Then the screaming started. Down in the lower parts of the ship where most people lived, families held each other tight and tried not to cry. Children asked their parents why it was getting so cold, and the parents did not know what to say. In the hallways, people ran back and forth carrying blankets and warm clothes. Some tried to break into storage rooms looking for extra food. Others just sat on the floor and stared at nothing. The ship's important people met in a room near the bridge to talk about what to do. Chief Medical Officer Helen Parks said they could try to put most people into the emergency sleep pods, but those pods needed power to work. Security Chief Ben Rodriguez said his men were already having trouble keeping people from fighting each other. The head of engineering, a woman named Amy Foster, said her team was doing everything they could, but the reactors were completely dead. While all the important people talked and argued, a man named Jake Morrison walked slowly through the ships. Lower levels. Jake was quiet and did not talk much to other people. He had worked as an engineer in the military before joining the colony mission. Most people did not pay attention to him because he kept to himself and did his job without making noise. But Jake had lived and worked in some of the coldest places humans had ever been. He had spent 2 years on the ice moons of Jupiter, where the temperature could kill a person in minutes. He knew things about staying alive that the other engineers had never learned. Jake went to places on the ship where other people did not go. He looked through the recycling centers where all the ship's waste was processed. He checked the food preparation areas where organic material was turned into meals for the colonists. While everyone else was running around in panic, Jake was collecting things. He gathered bone meal from the protein processors. He took organic compounds from the waste systems. He picked up pieces of metal that had been thrown away when equipment was fixed or replaced. Other engineers saw Jake doing this strange work, and some of them laughed. They thought he had gone crazy from fear, like so many others. One man asked Jake what he was doing with all the garbage he was collecting. Jake looked at the man with calm eyes and said he was preparing to build something that would keep them all alive. The man walked away, shaking his head and muttering about people who lose their minds when things get bad. Amy Foster was different. She watched Jake work and noticed that everything he did was careful and planned. She had worked with Jake for months and knew he was not the kind of person who did things without good reasons. When she asked him what he was planning, Jake told her he needed to build a furnace. Not the kind of furnace that used electricity or fusion power, but the kind that humans had used for thousands of years before they ever left Earth. Amy did not understand at first. She asked Jake how an old-fashioned fire could possibly help them when their advanced technology had failed. Jake stopped his work and looked at her seriously. He told her that humans had survived ice ages and frozen winters, long before they had fusion reactors or spaceships. Fire was the first technology that made humans different from animals. Fire was what kept people alive when everything else failed. The temperature on the ship kept dropping. Frost began to form on the walls in the outer sections. People wrapped themselves in every piece of clothing they could find, but it was not enough. Some of the older colonists and small children were already getting sick from the cold. Dr. Parks set up medical stations to treat people who were starting to freeze, but she did not have enough supplies or warm places to put everyone. Jake finished gathering the materials he needed and found a large empty space in one of the cargo areas. He started to work with his hands, building something that looked like nothing anyone had seen before. He mixed the bone meal with other organic materials to make a kind of clay. He shaped pieces of metal to direct airflow. He built a structure that could contain and focus heat in ways that the ship's designers had never imagined. Some people heard about what Jake was doing and came to watch. A few offered to help, but most just stared and whispered to each other about the crazy man who thought he could save them all with fire and bones. Jake did not pay attention to what they said. He worked steadily and calmly while around him the temperature continued to fall and people continued to panic. Amy Foster stayed with Jake and helped him carry materials. She still did not fully understand what he was building, but she trusted him. When other engineers said Jake was wasting time that could be used to fix the reactors, Amy defended him. She told them that maybe it was time to try something different. Maybe the old ways were better than the new ways. When everything modern had stopped working. By the end of the first day, Jake had built the basic structure of his furnace. It looked strange and primitive compared to everything else on the advanced colony ship, but Jake smiled when he looked at it. He knew something that all the other people had forgotten. Humans had survived for millions of years without fusion reactors and computer systems. They had survived because they could make fire and they could work together. Soon he would show everyone on the ship that the most important human technology was not the newest one, but the oldest one. The second day was worse than the first. Jake Morrison woke up early and could see his breath in the cold air of his sleeping quarters. The ship was dying around them, and most people had given up hope. He dressed quickly in the warmest clothes he could find and went back to the cargo bay where his furnace waited. The structure he had built looked rough and simple, but Jake knew it would work. He had learned how to make fire in places where fire should not be possible. Throughout the ship, people were breaking down. Families who had been friends for the whole journey were now fighting over blankets and warm clothing. Some colonists had broken into storage areas and were taking food and supplies for themselves. Security Chief Ben Rodriguez tried to keep order with his officers, but many of the security people had left their jobs to take care of their own families. Ben understood why they did it, but it made his job much harder. In the medical areas, Dr. Helen Parks was seeing more and more sick people. The cold was making everyone weak, and the oldest and youngest colonists were getting very ill. She had medicines that could help, but no way to keep people warm enough to get better. Some people were starting to freeze to death, and she could not stop it. She felt helpless watching good people die from something as simple as cold air. Captain Lisa Carter called another meeting of the ship's leaders, but only half of them came. The others were too busy trying to take care of their own people, or had lost hope completely. The people who did come to the meeting were scared and angry. They argued about what to do, but had no good answers. Some wanted to put people into emergency sleep pods even though the pods needed power they did not have. Others wanted to send people to different parts of the ship, but everywhere was getting cold. While the leaders argued, Jake worked on his furnace with steady hands. Amy Foster had stayed with him through the night and helped him finish the most important parts. She was still not sure his plan would work, but she had seen Jake solve impossible problems before. When other engineers came to tell them they were wasting time, Amy sent them away. She told them to go fix the reactors if they were so smart. Jake had designed his furnace using knowledge that was older than space travel. He knew that certain kinds of bones could be processed into materials that would hold heat better than metal. He knew which organic wastes would burn hot and clean. He knew how to shape air passages so that fire would burn at exactly the right temperature. These were things humans had learned over thousands of years of making fires to stay alive. About Jake's project began to spread through the ship in whispers. Some people said he was building something that could save them. Others said he had lost his mind and was playing with garbage while they all froze to death. A few colonists came to the cargo bay to see what he was doing. Most of them looked at the strange structure Jake had built and walked away shaking their heads. But some people stayed. A young woman named Katie Mills had worked in the ship's food processing area, and she understood what Jake was doing with the organic materials. She offered to help him gather the right kinds of waste products. An older man named Pete Jackson had been a farmer on Earth before joining the colony, and he knew how to work with his hands. He helped Jake shape the metal pieces that would direct airflow through the furnace. Ben Rodriguez came to see Jake's work on the afternoon of the second day. The security chief was tired and worried about keeping order on the ship. He had heard that some people were planning to take over parts of the ship by force. When he saw Jake's furnace, he did not understand what it was supposed to do. Jake explained that he was building something that would make heat and light without needing the ship's power systems. Ben asked Jake if he really thought a fire could keep 12,000 people warm. Jake told him that one fire would not be enough, but many fires could do the job. He said that humans had heated whole cities with fire before they had electricity. Ben looked at the rough structure Jake had built and tried to imagine it working. It seemed impossible, but everything else had already failed. Dr. Parks came to the cargo bay that evening. She was exhausted from trying to help sick people with no way to make them warm. She looked at Jake's furnace and asked him when it would be ready to use. Jake told her he needed one more day to finish the air systems and test the fuel mixture. Dr. Parks nodded and said she would try to keep people alive until then. She did not say that some people might not last another day. Jake worked through the second night with his small group of helpers. Amy Foster used her engineering skills to help him build the airflow controls. Katie Mills processed organic waste, materials into fuel that would burn cleanly. Pete Jackson welded metal pieces together to make the structure stronger. They worked by the light of small battery-powered lamps that would not last much longer. As they worked, Jake taught them what he was doing and why. He explained how bone ash could be used to make a kind of ceramic that would hold heat better than anything the ship's factories could produce. He showed them how to mix organic compounds so they would burn at high temperatures without making dangerous smoke. He demonstrated how airflow could be controlled to make fire burn exactly the way they needed it to burn. The people helping Jake began to understand that what he was building was not just a simple fire. It was a carefully designed system that used old knowledge to solve new problems. Katie Mills said it was like building a bridge between the past and the future. Pete Jackson said it reminded him of his grandfather, who could fix anything with simple tools and smart thinking. By the morning of the third day, Jake's furnace was ready for its first test. Ice had formed on the walls of the cargo bay, and everyone's breath made clouds in the cold air. The few people who had stayed to help Jake gathered around the structure he had built. It did not look like much compared to the high-tech systems throughout the rest of the ship, but Jake was confident it would work. He loaded the first fuel mixture into the combustion chamber and checked all the airflow controls one more time. Amy Foster watched nervously as Jake prepared to light the first fire. She had spent her whole career working with fusion reactors and computer-controlled systems. The idea of making fire with bones and waste materials seemed too simple to work. Jake struck a spark and touched it to the fuel mixture. For a moment nothing happened. Then a small flame appeared and began to grow. The flame got bigger and brighter as air flowed through Jake's carefully designed passages. Heat began to radiate from the furnace structure, and for the first time in 2 days, the people in the cargo bay felt warm air on their faces. Amy Foster stared at the growing fire and felt tears on her cheeks. She had not realized how cold and hopeless she had become until she felt the heat from Jake's furnace. Around them, the other helpers smiled and held out their hands toward the warmth. Jake Morrison looked at his fire and nodded with satisfaction. The first step was complete, and now the real work could begin. The fire changed everything. Within an hour of Jake Morrison lighting his first furnace, word had spread through the coldest parts of the ship that there was warmth in Cargo Bay 12. People came slowly at first, just a few families who had heard rumors about the strange man who was making fire from bones and waste. They stood in the doorway of the cargo bay and stared at the flames dancing inside Jake's rough-built structure. Most had never seen a real fire before in their lives. Children pressed their faces against the warm air that flowed from the furnace while their parents watched with wide eyes. An elderly woman named Grace Cooper had been so cold she could barely walk, but after standing near Jake's fire for 10 minutes, she was able to move her fingers again. A small boy named Danny Kim stopped shivering for the first time in 2 days. Word spread faster after that, and more people came to see the miracle. In the cargo bay, Jake knew that one fire would not be enough to save 12,000 people. He needed to build many more furnaces, and he needed to build them quickly. The temperature throughout the ship was still falling, and people in the farthest sections were getting dangerously cold. But Jake also knew he could not build all the furnaces by himself. He needed to teach other people how to do the work. Amy Foster became his first real student. She watched everything Jake did and asked questions about why he made each choice. Jake showed her how to mix bone meal with clay-like materials from the waste processing systems to make heat-resistant ceramic. He taught her which organic compounds would burn cleanly and which ones would make dangerous smoke. Amy had spent years learning about fusion reactors and quantum mechanics, but now she was learning about something much older and more basic. Pete Jackson brought his farming skills to help Jake design better airflow systems. On Earth, Pete had learned to control fire for clearing fields and heating barns. He understood how to make fire burn hot or cool, depending on how much air reached the flames. Together, Jake and Pete worked out designs for furnaces that could be built in different sizes for different spaces on the ship. Katie Mills organized teams of people to gather and process the materials they needed. She knew which food waste would burn well and which would not. She taught volunteers how to collect bone meal from the protein processing systems and how to prepare organic compounds for fuel. Katie had a gift for explaining complicated things in simple ways, and soon she had dozens of people working to gather materials for more furnaces. Dr. Helen Parks came to the cargo bay on the 3rd day and was amazed by what she saw. The medical officer had been fighting a losing battle against cold-related sickness throughout the ship. But here in the warm space around Jake's fire, sick people were getting better. She set up a temporary medical station near the furnace and brought some of her sickest patients to recover in the heat. Captain Lisa Carter finally came to see Jake's work on the evening of the 3rd day. She had been trying to coordinate repairs to the main reactors while also dealing with growing unrest among the colonists. When she walked into the cargo bay and felt the warm air from Jake's furnace, she understood for the first time that they might actually survive this disaster. She found Jake working on plans for a second furnace and asked him what he needed to build more. Jake told the captain he needed official permission to use more cargo spaces and to take materials from throughout the ship. He also needed people to stop panicking long enough to learn how to build and maintain the furnaces themselves. Lisa looked around the cargo bay, at the families gathered near the fire, at the children playing in the warm air, at the sick people getting better under Dr. Park's care. She gave Jake permission to use whatever spaces and materials he needed. Ben Rodriguez assigned 2 of his remaining security officers to help protect Jake's work and keep order in the areas where new furnaces were being built. The security chief had seen how much calmer people became when they were warm, and he wanted to make sure nothing interfered with Jake's project. He also started learning how to build furnaces himself, because he understood that everyone would need to know these skills. Building the second furnace went much faster than the first, because Jake now had experienced helpers. Amy Foster led a team that prepared the ceramic materials, while Pete Jackson supervised construction of the metal framework. Katie Mills made sure they had enough fuel prepared and ready to burn. By the end of the 4th day, they had a second fire burning in another cargo bay. The process of building each new furnace became a kind of school where Jake taught larger groups of people the skills they would need. He showed them how to read the color of flames to know if the fire was burning correctly. He taught them how to adjust airflow to control temperature. He explained how to prepare different kinds of fuel for different situations. Most importantly, he taught them that fire was not something to be afraid of, but something to understand and control as more furnaces came online. Jake's team was able to establish warm zones throughout the lower parts of the ship. Families began moving their belongings to these areas and setting up temporary homes near the fires. The cargo bays and unused storage spaces became communities where people worked together to maintain their furnaces and take care of each other. Jake noticed that something interesting was happening as people learned to tend the fires. The panic and selfishness that had taken over the ship in the first days of the crisis began to disappear. When people had to work together to keep their fire burning, they stopped fighting with each other. When children helped gather fuel for the furnaces, they learned to cooperate instead of competing. When families shared the warm spaces around the fires, they started helping each other instead of hoarding supplies. Dr. Parks reported that medical emergencies were decreasing in the areas where furnaces were operating, not just because people were warmer, but because they were working together and taking better care of each other. She moved her main medical station to the largest heated area and found that her patients recovered faster when they were surrounded by the warmth and activity of the furnace communities. Amy Foster continued working on the reactor problem, but now she had a warm place to work and helpers who were not panicking. She set up her equipment near one of Jake's fires and found that she could think more clearly in the steady warmth. Her team made more progress on reactor repairs in 2 days of working near the furnaces than they had made in the previous week of working in the cold dot. By the end of the 5th day, Jake's network of furnaces was providing heat and light to more than half the colonists on the ship. The remaining cold areas were still dangerous, but there was now hope that everyone could be brought to safety before they froze. Jake himself had become something he had never expected to be, a teacher and a leader. People came to him with questions about fire and fuel, but also with questions about how to organize their communities and solve problems together. Jake looked at the dozens of fires burning throughout the ship and felt proud of what they had accomplished. But he also knew this was just the beginning. They needed to establish reliable fuel supplies, train more people to maintain the furnaces, and create systems that could keep everyone warm until the main reactors could be repaired. The hardest work was still ahead of them, but now they had the most important thing they needed: hope and the knowledge that humans could survive anything if they worked together and remembered the old wisdom that had kept their species alive for thousands of years. The transformation of the ship happened faster than anyone expected. By the 6th day, Jake Morrison's furnaces were burning in 8 different locations, and the word had spread to every corner of the meridian that there was hope. Families packed their belongings and moved toward the warm zones, creating a great migration from the outer decks to the areas where fire provided life. Children who had been quiet and scared for days began laughing again as they played in the dancing light. Of the Flames' captain, Lisa Carter made the hardest decision of her career on that sixth day. She officially abandoned the upper levels of the ship and ordered all essential operations to be moved to the heated areas. The bridge was relocated to a command station built near the largest cluster of Jake's furnaces. Life support systems that still worked were rerouted to serve only the warm zones. It meant giving up on huge sections of the meridian, but it also meant concentrating their resources where people could actually survive. Jake found himself teaching furnace construction to larger and larger groups of colonists. His quiet manner and patient explanations made him a natural teacher, even though he had never wanted to be the center of attention. He showed people how to build different sizes of furnaces for different spaces. Large community furnaces that could warm hundreds of people were built in the biggest cargo areas. Smaller personal furnaces were constructed for individual families in the storage rooms and maintenance areas. Amy Foster divided her time between learning Jake's fire building techniques and continuing to work on the reactor problem. She had moved her engineering equipment to a warm workshop next to one of the community furnaces and found that her team could work much more effectively when they were not freezing. The steady heat helped their electronic equipment function better and kept their minds sharp for solving complex problems. Dr. Helen Parks established her main medical center in the heart of the largest heated zone. She was amazed by how quickly people recovered from cold-related illnesses once they were brought near the fires. But more than that, she noticed that people were taking better care of each other. Families shared food and blankets without being asked. Strangers helped each other build and maintain furnaces. The medical emergencies she had been dealing with were mostly replaced by minor cuts and burns from people learning to work with fire. The process of learning to manage fire brought out skills in people that they never knew they had. Pete Jackson became the ship's expert on airflow and ventilation, teaching others how to keep smoke from building up in enclosed spaces. Katie Mills organized supply chains that would have impressed corporate managers, coordinating the collection and processing of organic materials from throughout the ship. Even children found important jobs, gathering small bits of fuel and helping to monitor the fires. Ben Rodriguez discovered that his job as security chief had completely changed. Instead of breaking up fights and dealing with theft, he was now helping coordinate the movement of people and supplies to the heated areas. Crime had almost disappeared in the warm zones because everyone understood that they needed to work together to survive. People who had been ready to fight each other over food were now sharing meals around the community fires. Jake's furnaces created more than just heat and light. They created gathering places where people came together to work and talk and share their lives. In the evenings, colonists would gather around the fires to tell stories and sing songs. Children learned games that had been played around fires for thousands of years. Adults shared knowledge and skills that helped everyone live better. The furnaces became the hearts of small communities that grew stronger every day. The fuel supply system that Katie Mills organized became a model of cooperation and efficiency. Every person on the ship had a job to do in gathering, processing, or distributing the materials needed to keep the fires burning. People learned to see waste products as valuable resources. Organic materials that would have been recycled or discarded became precious fuel. Even human waste was processed into components that could be burned cleanly and safely. Jake taught people to read their fires like others might read books. The color of the flames told them about the temperature and efficiency of combustion. The sound of the burning materials indicated whether airflow was correct. The smell of the smoke revealed what kind of fuel was being consumed and whether it was burning cleanly. People who had lived their entire lives with electric heating. Systems became experts at managing open fires. Amy Foster made a breakthrough on the 7th day, working in her warm workshop with equipment that functioned properly in the steady heat. Her team identified the specific component failure that had shut down the fusion reactors. It was a complex problem that would take days or weeks to repair. But for the first time since the crisis began, they had a clear path to restoring main power. Amy shared the news with Captain Carter and Jake, explaining that they now had time to complete the repairs properly. The news that the reactors could eventually be fixed brought celebration throughout the heated areas of the ship. But Jake noticed something interesting in people's reactions. Many colonists were not eager to abandon the communities they had built around the furnaces. They had discovered something valuable in the simple act of working together to maintain fire and take care of each other. Children did not want to leave the warm gathering places where they had made friends. Adults had found purpose and meaning in the daily work of keeping their communities. Alive. Dr. Parks documented what she called the psychological transformation of the colonists. People who had been depressed and hopeless in the early days of the crisis had become confident and capable. Individuals who had never worked with their hands before had become skilled at practical tasks. Most importantly, colonists who had been strangers to each other had formed tight communities based on mutual dependence and shared purpose. Jake Morrison himself had changed the most of all. The quiet, solitary engineer who had preferred to work alone had become a leader and teacher who inspired others. He spent his days moving from furnace to furnace, helping people solve problems and improve their techniques. He had become the person others came to for advice, not just about fire, but about organizing work and resolving conflicts. His calm confidence helped everyone believe that they could handle whatever challenges came next. The warm zones of the ship had become something completely different from the sterile, high-tech environment that the colonists had known during their journey. The areas around the furnaces were filled with the sounds of people working and talking and living together. The light from the fires cast dancing shadows that made the metal walls seem warm and alive. The air smelled of burning organic materials and cooking food instead of the recycled atmosphere that had filled the ship before. Captain Carter walked through the heated communities each evening and marveled at what Jake's simple idea had created. The crisis that had threatened to destroy them all had instead taught them something essential about being human. They had rediscovered skills and ways of living that their ancestors had known, but that had been forgotten in the age of advanced technology. They had learned that survival was not just about having the right equipment, but about having the right knowledge and the willingness to work together. On the 8th day, Jake stood in the central community area and looked at the dozens of fires burning throughout the ship. Hundreds of people moved around the furnaces, tending flames, processing fuel, caring for children, and sharing meals. The warm air was filled with conversation and laughter. These people were no longer just passengers on a damaged ship. They had become something much more important. They had become a community that knew how to survive and thrive no matter what challenges they faced. The fires had saved their lives, but more than that, the fires had taught them who they really were. 3 weeks after the reactors had failed, the Meridian was no longer the same ship that had left Earth. Jake Morrison stood in what had once been cargo, Bay 12, and watched the bustling community that had grown around his first furnace. Children played games in the warm light while their parents worked at tasks that would have been unimaginable when the journey began. The central fire burned steadily at the heart of it all, tended by people who had learned to read flames like their ancestors had read the weather. The ship now had 47 furnaces burning in a network that provided heat and light to all 12,000 colonists. What had started as a desperate attempt to survive had become a new way of living that no one wanted to abandon. The warm zones were filled with workshops where people made tools and furniture from salvaged materials. Gardens grew in containers near the fires, using processed waste as fertilizer. Markets operated where colonists traded goods and services in systems that had developed naturally around the sharing of fire and fuel. Captain Lisa Carter had moved her command center to the main community area and found that she could run the ship more effectively from there than she ever had from the isolated bridge. Important decisions were now made in consultation with the leaders who had emerged in each of the heated communities. Jake Morrison had become her most trusted advisor, not because of any official appointment, but because people throughout the ship had come to respect his wisdom and judgment. Amy Foster and her engineering team had finally completed repairs to the first fusion reactor. The work had taken longer than expected because they insisted on doing it properly rather than rushing to get power back online. Working in their warm workshop near one of Jake's furnaces, they had identified and fixed not just the original problem, but several other issues that could have caused future failures. When Amy announced that they were ready to restart the reactor, the response throughout the ship was mixed. Many colonists were genuinely excited about the prospect of having electric power and modern heating systems again, but others worried about what would happen to the communities they had built around the furnaces. Children who had learned to tend fires and process fuel wondered if they would still have important jobs to do. Adults who had discovered talents for practical work feared returning to the inactive roles they had played during the original journey. Jake Morrison called a meeting in the largest community area to discuss what would happen when main power was restored. Nearly 1,000 colonists gathered around the central furnace to hear him speak. Jake had never been comfortable talking to large groups, but the past 3 weeks had changed him in ways he was still discovering. He stood before the crowd with the confidence of someone who had proven that ancient wisdom could solve modern problems. He told the gathered colonists that the return of electric power would make their lives easier and safer, but it did not have to end the communities they had built around the fires. The skills they had learned and the bonds they had formed were too valuable to abandon. Jake proposed that they keep many of the furnaces burning even after the reactors were online, not because they needed them for heat, but because they needed them for what the fires represented. Dr. Helen Parks had documented remarkable changes in the physical and mental health of the colonists during the crisis. People were stronger and more capable than they had been at the start of the journey. Children had developed practical skills and confidence that would serve them well when they reached their new planet. Adults had learned to work with their hands and solve problems creatively. Most importantly, everyone had learned that they could depend on each other in ways that went far beyond the formal structures of the colony mission. The vote to keep the furnace communities operating alongside the restored power systems was unanimous. The colonists had discovered something they did not want to lose. They had found a way of living that connected them to the most fundamental aspects of being human. The fires would continue to burn, not just as backup heating systems, but as gathering places where people came together to work and learn and share their lives. When Amy Foster finally restarted the first fusion reactor, the lights that came on throughout the ship were greeted with cheers and applause. But in the community areas around the furnaces, people continued their daily routines of tending fires and processing fuel and caring for each other. The electric lighting was welcome, but it did not replace the warm glow of the flames that had become the centers of their new communities. Jake Morrison found himself appointed to a new position that had never existed on the original colony mission. He became the ship's firekeeper, responsible for maintaining the knowledge and skills that had saved them all. His job was to make sure that every colonist, including children born during the rest of the journey, would learn how to build and maintain fires. This knowledge would be essential when they reached their destination planet and had to survive with limited technology while building their new civilization. The education system on the ship was completely restructured around the practical skills that people had learned during the crisis. Children still studied mathematics and science and literature, but they also learned to work with their hands, to understand natural processes, and to cooperate in essential tasks. Adults continued their specialized training for the colony mission, but everyone also became experts in the fundamental technologies that had kept humans alive throughout history. Katie Mills established the first formal school for fire management and fuel processing. Her classes were always full because colonists understood that these skills might mean the difference between life and death on their new world. Pete Jackson taught courses in air management and ventilation that were attended by engineers and farmers alike. Even Dr. Parks incorporated knowledge about fire and heat into our medical training programs. The social structure of the ship had been permanently changed by the crisis. The rigid hierarchy that had existed during the early part of the journey was replaced by a more flexible system based on knowledge, skill, and contribution to the community. People who had been considered unimportant in the original mission structure had become essential leaders because they possessed practical abilities that everyone needed. Ben Rodriguez noticed that his security concerns had fundamentally changed. Instead of dealing with crime and conflict, he now focused on coordinating emergency responses and maintaining the safety systems around the furnaces. The communities that had formed around the fires were largely self-governing, with conflicts resolved through discussion and consensus rather than enforcement of rules from above. Jake Morrison spent his evenings walking through the ship's warm zones, checking on the various furnaces and talking with the people who tended them. Each community had developed its own character and specialties, but all were united by the shared knowledge of fire and the understanding that they depended on each other for survival. Children who had been born on Earth ran and played alongside. Children who had been born in space, all of them learning the ancient skills that connected them to thousands of generations of human ancestors. The approaching end of their journey to the new planet was no longer viewed with the same mixture of excitement and anxiety that had characterized the early part of their trip. The colonists now felt confident that they could handle whatever challenges awaited them on their new world. They had proven to themselves that humans could adapt and survive and thrive even when their most advanced technologies failed them. Jake Morrison stood before his aunt's original furnace on the final